planes and enjoying it, and then the clouds came in, but I was already tucked away, thank God. I'm so happy to be here. I think this is the second time I've been here, isn't it? Yeah, I love this place. Well, I thought I'd first tell you a little bit, just tell you about my encounter up on the Rosebud Reservation that led in part to the writing of this novel. And so this is a piece called The Ghost Shirt, and this is nonfiction, this is true. It was a typical hot sun-soaked day in August when I entered the cool shadows of the small Catholic church on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota 25 years ago. A Lakota woman in a long brown skirt and plain white shirt graciously asked if I would like her to show me around. And I followed her as she explained that the wall decorations in traditional Lakota colors and the paintings were all done by Native artists. It was startling to see the beautiful renderings of familiar biblical images through local eyes, and strangely moving too. Then we went to a small museum where she paused in front of a series of drawers built into a wall. "Have you heard of the massacre at Wounded Knee?" she asked in a quiet voice. I nodded, unsure what was next. It took both of her hands to pull the wide, shallow drawer open, although it slid with a mere whisper. She stepped aside and let me stare at the contents. A frayed, homemade shirt painted the pale blue of the Dakota sky, decorated with figures of butterflies, birds, and buffalo and antelope among all manner of animals. It took my breath. I had only read about these shirts, had never hoped to see one. Years later, a Native American friend told me the woman should not have displayed it for a white person because it was sacred. I felt ashamed and grateful both. At that moment, though, I felt the power like a faint mist rising from that shirt with the frayed neck and hem, blue paint flaking in places, the red not the color of blood, the yellow and white as saturated as the day the maker drew the lost figures. It was a homely piece of clothing, yet as rare as a piece of the true cross for believers. I understood why it belonged in the church and why my guide was protective of it. I don't know exactly why she chose to show it to me, but it was a gift that stayed with me over the years. You could say that the massacre at Wounded Knee that took place 128 years ago was because of a shirt like the one I saw, which somehow survived the slaughter of over 300 women, children, elderly, and only a few young warriors. For over a year, Native peoples had been gathering on Pine Ridge Reservation drawn by a new religious ceremony, the ghost dance. There was no violence, nothing but half-starved people desperate for hope, dancing, chanting, and playing drums in nonstop worship to bring back their old world. The promise was that the buffalo would come down the red road, leading all the other animals to restore the earth and bring the vanquished people back their land, their lives. With the perspective of contemporary culture and distance, it is amazing that such worship would threaten the white settlers, government agents, and army, but it did. Despite being ordered to stop dancing, the people continued. Despite being hungry because the Indian agents denied them subsidies and they weren't allowed weapons or means to hunt the game that had been driven away from their reservation, they danced. They danced in the summer heat and into the winter cold of November and December, their feet wrapped in rags. As the army gathered, hauling in their newest and biggest cannons and guns, the people added another promise for their return to prosperity. They made ghost shirts that would stop the bullets of the guns pointed at them by drawing on the power of their connection to the sacred animals, the earth and the sky. Nothing could stop the dance that would bring the old world back. It is a gift to possess such powerful belief. And the day I saw the ghost shirt, I felt a tiny surge of the hope it carried that made me believe it might be possible to experience that transformation of reality. For over 25 years, I've thought about the two realities presented that day on Rosebud and all those years earlier on Pine Ridge at Wounded Knee Creek. A pragmatist would join the army and laugh at the notion of a shirt that could repel bullets and a dance that could bring back a nearly extinct animal that had been slaughtered to make room for white settlements. If these beliefs were so absurd, so patently ridiculous in the face of reality, why were the authorities so afraid? That's what the shirt says to me. Such a homely object. It's still powerful enough to bring down the wrath of an entire government. Is there a fear, a suspicion, or a hope that lurks in the backs of our minds that the official reality isn't as real as it claims to be? Humans, especially governments and armies, have a history of killing what they don't understand, what they fear. A painted blue cotton shirt waits in the cool dark of a drawer in a little church in South Dakota, holding the secret. Now I'm going to read to you, thank you. So at the core of this novel, The Bones of Paradise, is the massacre at Wounded Knee, and the novel begins 10 years after that massacre and addresses things that begin to happen both to the White Ranch families and to Native families. So it begins one day, and it will explain itself, okay? Chapter 1. It was mid-morning in early May when J.B. Bennett crested the hill, stopped, and surveyed the little Sandhills meadow where the windmill was slowly clanking in a wobbly circle. The metal rubbing on metal in an uneven cadence made him reach for the small tin of grease in his saddlebag, the one he already knew he'd pulled out yesterday and left sitting on the window ledge in the tool shed where he'd repacked his saddlebags for the trip to his father's ranch this morning. It was getting to be harder to keep track of every little detail. He wasn't that old, he reasoned, but then he had the boy and the 20,000 acres and the men and the cattle. He lifted his hand and let it drop back to the saddle horn. It was the other thing that drove his mind these days. He reached in his shirt pocket and pulled out the photograph he'd recovered from his son's dresser drawer a few hours ago. God only knew where Hayward had disappeared to. The picture showed his wife, Dulcinea, as she'd been in 1880 when she came to Nebraska, fresh-faced and fiercely happy, her long auburn hair barely contained by a ribbon, her hand shading her eyes as if she could see as far down the years as it would take to find him again and punish him for what he'd done. The wind was blowing so hard that day. He remembered praying that she wouldn't notice the fine grit from the sandhills that found its way into every crevice and seasoned your food. That night as they lay out in their bedrolls, she teased him about the sand between his toes after they'd made love. It wasn't their first time. That had happened when they agreed to marry at her parents' home in Chicago. By the time they bedded their first night on their new ranch in a new land, her initial shyness was replaced by a light teasing he found delightful. He grimaced now. When had he ever used that word? But that was her effect on him. She brought a new language with her and made it his. He wondered if his son Hayward would miss the picture of his mother. This one had been lovingly preserved, wrapped in a pale blue silk scarf that must have been hers, embedded carefully in a stack of his old baby clothes, hand-me-downs from his older brother Cullen. J.B. couldn't even think Cullen's name without wincing, while the staggering whine clank of the windmill seemed to grate harder on his ears. Today he was determined to find Cullen and bring him home, his father drum be damned. He gathered the reins in his fist, and the young chestnut horse lifted its head and pawed, impatient with the rider who paused too long. God damn you, Drum. J.B. cursed his father as part of the chain of thoughts that became his burden of late. For years, he'd managed to work himself to such exhaustion he couldn't begin to think, moving from dark to dark in a state of rigid sleeplessness and pain. When Hayward cried, he was comforted by a woman J.B. hired from town, or lately the wife of his foreman. It wasn't enough, of course. Dulcinea was the shadow beside him every minute of the day. So often as not, he ended up in a place like this meadow this morning, the site of the picnic where she told him she was pregnant with their first child, and they made love on a blanket slowly and carefully, though she said there was no worry. His only experience the animals he cared for, which made his inquiries awkward and ridiculous. He blushed at the thought at how it made her laugh when he asked if she had been in heat of late. She was so happy then. They both were. He brushed the picture with his lips and tucked it safely in his pocket. He gazed at the hills covered with the mint green of bluestem and grama grass among last year's taller dried stalks that would gradually collapse and disappear as spring progressed. Drought over, the Omaha Herald proclaimed after a winter of snow and spring rains, prosperity on 1900 horizon. A new patch of low-lying prickly pear cactus had sprung up beyond the windmill and water tank. He'd have the men dig it out. It was a constant battle to hang on to the grass, the only thing to support the cattle that made his living. A person had to keep his eye on the smallest detail while the vast emptiness constantly tugged at his vision. You can get lost in a heartbeat out here, he told his wife. It took him almost most of his life to realize the significance of his own words. For some reason this morning, every little thought was like a handful of nettles, stinging and chiding him as he tried to drop it and move past. Better to make a list of chores, keep a running tally. He took a deep breath. To the left of the tank, the ragged edge of grass gave way to the pale sand beneath, where a small herd of his cattle had sheltered in the late spring snowstorm last week. Trapped by the drifts, they had eaten the grass down to its roots and churned up the sand so thoroughly, nothing would grow there again unless he could anchor it. The sun felt good on his face, warm and not burning yet, and the wind wasn't pushing against his skull so hard he could barely think either. He shifted in the saddle, lifted his hand again and shook his head. Couldn't keep his mind on business at all this morning. The horse reached around and nudged his boot toe with its nose as if to say, "Come on." Still he didn't move. Something held him back, as if once he went down that hill, everything in his life would be different, and he couldn't say why. And it wasn't only the business with his son, Cullen. He had this feeling a lot lately, and it was beginning to worry him. Maybe it was just age, but he thought of his father, Drum, who seemed sharper, more driven as he grew older, meaner. Old bastard. That's what the men called him when they didn't think JB was listening. JB called him worse than that when he didn't think they were listening. It was 20 years ago, almost to the day, since JB married and took ownership of this land. He looked across the hills in the direction of the main house nestled in a valley and accessible by wagon from the main north-south road, only during good weather. Otherwise, it was a long trip by horseback to go around the gumbo mud flats and low spots that made small lakes out of the road as soon as any kind of weather arrived. JB had chosen the place with a purpose in mind, to be as far from his father as possible when he managed to bargain the 20,000 acres off him. The one part of the bargain he hadn't told his wife the day he met her at the train in North Platte proved to be their undoing. When she stepped off the train, a young woman of 18, looking for a Western adventure on a real cattle ranch and willing to marry an unlikely candidate in the Nebraska sandhills, he decided to wait. But as soon as he held his first baby boy, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. He and Dulcinea were always together in the beginning, overseeing the building of their brick house made from their own clay deposit on the river that ran through their land. It took more time, but they were terrified of prairie fires that would sweep down on them with no warning. They lived in a rotted timber lean-to that first summer, using dried dung or kerosene toted from town in 50-gallon drums to cook on the large stove that would eventually become the central feature of their kitchen. Maybe if he had a good year now, cattle prices held, he could offer to buy one of those pre-made houses out of the Sears Roebuck catalog. Maybe she'd see that as a peace offering, a brand new house. He rubbed his chin, the stubble already starting, though he'd carefully shaved each morning in case she changed her mind and showed up again. First she'd moved to Babylon, then on to Cody, Rushville, and Chadron, towns along the east-west road across the top of the sandhills. Then she'd come back to Babylon, gone to Chicago, visiting her people, then up to Rosebud to teach. Would she stay away for good this time, furious that he'd refused to send Hayward to live with her in town for school as the other ranch families were starting to do? Once in a while, when he got the sense she might be near, he shaved of an evening too, and would catch the reflection of his son, Hayward, watching him in the shadow of the doorway, face expressionless. That was another thing he had to do, get that boy to talk to him. 2 years ago, when the Trans-Mississippi Exposition opened in Omaha, Hayward begged to go, but JB had to say no. He hadn't the heart or nerve to admit how close to losing the ranch they were, so he said no, and that was final. The boy hadn't spoken more than 10 words a year since, but boys his age, what was he now? 15, 16, 17? Was there a birthday JB forgot? Had his mother written or arranged to meet? Dulcinea would know. She kept track of details like that. To her credit, she braved the heat, loneliness, moody men, and the sudden storms as well as anyone raised in the hills. JB spent that first summer grateful, relieved, and genuinely happy for the first time in his life. That last feeling had left him puzzled more often than not, wondering about the weight that seemed lifted. The iron hand that usually rode gripping the back of his neck simply disappeared. His own mother died when he was a boy, and he had a little recollection or understanding of what being around a female meant. His father never remarried, preferred to become the old bastard he remained the rest of his life, convinced that women, the female influence, destroyed a man's character if he wasn't careful, and almost no man could be that careful. Better to do without, he preached to his only child. Wait as long as you can before succumbing to the flesh. JB told his new wife about his father and those long nights when they lay in their bed under the stars, unable to sleep for the sheer closeness of the moon, the brightness making their naked bodies glow. And JB came to understand how wrong his father could be. Having a woman was the most wonderful thing he ever experienced. He didn't dare use that other word, love, didn't even recognize it, and could not say it when his new wife turned to him and whispered the words. His face shone with shyness and joy, which she might have mistaken for satisfaction and pride. He could not be sure. At that moment, he hoped she trusted the shyness, confident that she could teach him the language that would make such a difference in the coming years. When she turned to him, eyes expectant and happy, he thought she was simply satisfied with his lovemaking and the position of the bed away from the prying eyes of the men in the crude bunkhouse beyond the cottonwood trees. I love you, she said, lips parted, forming the words for him to repeat if he could or would. He stared at her in wonder and heard the distant voice of his own mother, a figure he could only imagine, a shadow, a voice so thin and whispery it might be the wind through the hills. Women said these words that came to him, and they filled a man, made him more than he was before. His father was right about the power of women, but he was wrong about what it did to a person. JB pulled Dulcinea close until he felt her chin nestle in the curve of his shoulder, her toes finding and pressing between his until they were perfectly fitted, and he could not be certain which parts were his alone, exclusive of hers. If he could not say the words, it would not matter, he thought. She was the same as him. Surely she felt it too. When the time came to fulfill his end of the bargain with his father, she'd trusted, she'd understand, he reassured himself, because that was how it was when people loved each other. The horse lifted its tail and dropped manure, kicked at a fly, shifted his front feet as if to turn around, raised his head and snorted. All right. JB lifted the reins and the horse took the first step down the hill, bracing its front legs, while the rider leaned back and gave him his head. At the bottom, they made their way to the windmill, whose noisy blades slowed to a stop as the wind died down. JB dismounted to give the horse a drink from the tank. While the animal plunged its nose and splashed the water, JB stared at the churned up sand. A piece of stone stuck out, maybe something he could take to Hayward, who liked to collect Indian relics. He eased it out and brushed away the sand. It looked like a hide scraper, careless to lose such a good tool. He used the side of his boot to clear around the hole from the scraper. He usually found arrowheads in these blowouts, occasionally a broken spear or tomahawk head, sometimes used rifle shells. He hefted the scraper, admiring the balance that let it fit easily in his palm, his fingers in hollows where others had held, thumb, forefinger, until it became an extension of his hand, the sharp edge ready for scraping the fat layer from the hide. Most of the Indians used white men's knives now, axes, guns, the old ways gone. Then his foot nudged something else, almost like an animal. He stepped back and looked down, then cautiously shoved with his boot toe. It didn't move. The sweet scent of wood smoke and cured hide rose unexpectedly and drifted away before he could grasp where it came from. He sighed and peered across the hay meadow and the distant hills sheathed in a faint green haze. He should get back on his horse and finish the ride to his father's ranch. He shouldn't spend another minute here. Cullen was waiting to come home. A meadowlark whistled, a male calling for a mate, the black chevron on the puffed-up gold chest shining and remarkably beautiful at that moment. The bird cocked its head and eyed him from the cattails at the edge of the marsh. Red-winged blackbirds shuttled back and forth across the meadow with the urgency of soldiers preparing for battle. His horse snorted and shook the water from its face, worked the bit in its mouth, and gazed at the man. A large flock of yellow butterflies bumped their way across the pasture, lighting on the blooms of flowers and tips of grass, then rising in a cloud like yellow ash. Sailing from a prairie fire, they continued past, on over the top of the ragged ridge of the sandhill. He had another hour in the saddle to reach Drum's place. To hell with it, he said, and bent to work. His thighs and the backs of his legs ached against the unusual stretch, but he didn't dare kneel for fear his knees wouldn't straighten. If I was a horse, I'd shoot myself, he muttered. As he was, he would have to start wrapping them in strips of muslin, soaked in camphor of a morning. Dulcie would have a good laugh about that when she saw him. The thought stabbed him with regret, and he dug harder against the sand that spilled back into the shallow hole. He felt a piece of wood with his fingers and pulled out a pipe with a foot-long carved cedar stem hanging half broken off. The barred turkey feathers still fresh. The red pipestone bowl had never been used, and the stem decorated with a line of crudely carved animals appeared new. Tiny yellow, red, black, and white cut glass beads hung below the mouthpiece along with the feathers. He squinted to make out the design scratched on its hard surface. Nothing that made sense. Tall and short lines like a series of teepees or stars. Hayward would like it, JB figured. He'd use it to encourage the boy to talk again. He poked the toe of his boot into the hole, feeling for the thing he touched earlier. When he found the yielding mass, a chill crossed his forehead and prickled his scalp. Deer, maybe. God damn it, he muttered and knelt, this time on his hands and knees, to carefully brush away the sand. The open mouth was filled with it, as if her last screams had solidified, the lips drawn back, snarling like a wounded bobcat. She fought to the end. Her open eyes clotted with sand. An apron of darkness cradled her tangled black hair that had come unbound from the traditional hide strips. He wondered how long she'd been dead. As soon as the tips of his fingers touched the stained sand, he knew, still wet. The tears in the corners of her eyes, not long. He swiftly tried to clear her mouth, her face. Warmth lingered on her skin. Her hands were like claws stretching up. He put his finger to her throat, below her ear, and could detect nothing. Then he leaned his head against her chest, listened. When he sat back on his heels, he slowly scanned the silent hills. How had he not seen the person who did this? He stilled his breath and concentrated for any sound at all. Nothing except the occasional whine from the windmill. How long had she lain here? Then he heard it, the faint click of metal against metal, and the grunting of a man in boots stumbling in the soft sand beyond the water tank. JB quickly looked toward his horse and the rifle in the scabbard before he stood to face the gun pointed at his chest. Oh, it's you. He held up a hand against the finger squeezing the trigger. Then a mere deep breath's time before he felt a hot, burning fist plow through his chest, opening his body to the light. First a red flare across the hills, then a whole bonfire of black sparks, then a white blanket, pressing so abruptly that he fell to the side of the grave, grasping the scraper he had grabbed the moment he heard the metallic click. Cullen, he thought, reaching for the boy and his mother as darkness swallowed them all. Then the wind gathered itself and the windmill began to spin, clinking loudly enough to be heard for years and miles. Well, yes, I killed off the main character in the first chapter. So that's the way it goes. That's the end of the book. Okay, so I thought I would just give you a quick introduction to Dulcinea and Rose. So Dulcinea is the widow of JB, and Rose is the sister of the dead native young girl. This is chapter 10. Dulcinea and Rose stopped their horses on the last hill. They're on their way back to the ranch. They've been brought from Rosebud. They got news of the killings. Dulcinea and Rose stopped their horses on the last hill overlooking the ranch and stepped down to stretch their legs after the long ride. Yesterday they left Rosebud, crossed into Nebraska, and stopped in Babylon for the night before coming into the hills. It was the end of the day, and Dulcinea could see lone cowboys on horseback driving cattle slowly out to summer pastures. They must be late this year because of JB's. She could not say the word yet. Glancing at Rose, she felt the kinship of sorrow and could not begin to imagine the loss of a sister. There was no hierarchy of grief, she realized, and her knees nearly buckled as her feet sank into the sand underfoot, where the horse and wagon traffic had killed the grass. She was almost home, and something made her pause. To the right was a vast blue lake, the surrounding marsh alive with birds feeding and mating. The air bore the moist scent of water, so blue it put the distant white blue sky to shame. She shaded her eyes to stare at the lake where pelicans floated peacefully. Nearby a pair of swans stretched their long necks, searching the waters for food. And further on, ducks dove and flapped, green necks glistening in the sun. After she rode down the hill, nothing would ever be the same. Right now, Dulcinea was between two worlds, but soon she would be in the one without her husband. She stuck her hand in the pocket of her traveling coat, fingered the crumpled yellow paper that carried JB's last coded message from March. Soon the birds take wing with my heart. She hadn't known about his poetic nature when they first married, or even after the boys were born. It took their separation for his silence to become eloquent in the anonymity of the telegram's compressed language. She fingered the paper's edge. She was wearing it soft as flannel. Beyond the lake, the hills rose green and humped like ancient fallen beasts. Their grass were remorseless and brutal hair. There were few trees that thrived naturally here. The occasional cedar the men hacked down because it drew too much water. The sand willows, mulberries, wild cherry, and cottonwood by the small creeks and rivers. She used to miss trees terribly, their casual interruption of the sky, until she returned to Chicago for a visit. Then she missed these ragged hills instead. She stooped to pick a wild pink rose, avoiding the tiny spines that slivered like unseen glass hairs into one's fingers. There was little scent, but the creamy softness of the petals, like the inside of a dog's ear, more than made up for it. She placed one on her tongue and imagined she could taste the hills, their bittersweet tang of life. Those three men don't have any cattle. Rose pointed east where the cowboys trotted their horses. Two of the men slumped in the saddle while the third rode with shoulders high and firm. Where did it happen? Dulcinea asked. Rose would know. She'd already been out there. Rose tipped her head at the three men. That way. Water tank between Bennett lands. Why was my husband there with your sister? How old was she? Dulcinea regretted her question the moment it left her mouth, and Rose grimaced like she'd been slapped. I'm sorry. Dulcinea reached out and placed her hand on Rose's arm. I don't understand. I don't either, Rose admitted. She was going to meet a man who could help her. She paused and picked up the reins she'd dropped to ground tie her horse. She was a good girl. Told me he had information about our mother. She appeared lost in thought as she watched the three men near the ranch yard. Maybe it wasn't your husband she was meeting. Dulcinea stared at the other woman, who bit her lower lip to stop from saying more. She stepped back and picked up her own reins, then pretended to check the cinch on the saddle before she mounted again. What could JB know about Rose's family? She told him about befriending Rose when they met in March, and he seemed ignorant of the family. She looked westward, where heavy clouds lay above a gray veil that meant someone was getting the luck and the rain. The sun hung near the lip of the horizon like a red ball at rest, and a low bush beside her suddenly exploded with lavender butterflies that crowded around her long skirt, washed up her bodice, and splashed against her face, their wings like an exhaled breath of powder as she closed her eyes. Something about the moment, his unexpected tenderness, made her long to hear him say her name again, just once more. Dulcinea, Dulcinea, as he whispered in her ear when they last met in March. A red-tailed hawk glided up and over the hill, the white winter belly almost obscured by summer brown, and then dipped toward the valley they traveled in, swift as an arrow. It hit a rabbit running a ragged pattern through the switchgrass along the road ahead. The rabbit uttered a single choked scream, then went limp and hopeless, back broken, eyes fixed as the bird swept upward. A single drop of blood splashed Rose's faded gray cloth-covered arm, the edges feathering out and sinking, already permanent. Rose followed the hawk's flight until it was out of sight. Stars, she whispered, stars making sure it was safe. Dulcinea knew they should go down the hill to the ranch. It would be dark soon and late for supper. She used to be the one cooking, along with whatever cowboy's wife they could hire. She knew what it meant to have extra mouths at the table. Rose didn't eat much, though, and she hadn't been hungry since they'd left the reservation, but she'd have to eat to keep track of things. She was going to find the person who killed JB. They were already sentenced to death in her heart. She glanced at Rose. What kind of vengeance did she plan? In the years she'd known her, Rose had been a fair person, but anything to do with family was outside fairness. Dulcinea felt the same. Your husband left you a lot of land, Rose said, squinting, her eyes squinting into the distance. I wish he hadn't. Dulcinea was surprised by her bitter tone, as if she blamed the land itself. She had thought of nothing except getting home and making certain that Rose was right. Stranger things happened. Maybe JB was still alive, and she couldn't think that. She half expected her husband to see her from atop another hill, to gallop toward her, waving hat and arm, as he had every other time she arrived. What are we going to do? Dulcinea turned to the other woman. Rose stared at the ranch below, and then shifted her eyes back to Dulcinea. We're going to find out who did this. Look and listen. Someone knows something. My sister will help us. Rose looked down at her mount's wind-tingled mane, combed it carefully with her fingers as the horse gazed longingly at the others, going home for the night. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions now. Some of you have already read the book. Some of you are wondering what the heck this thing is about. So if you have any questions about writing, about research, about life, about who's going to win the Final Four, I've got ideas. Yes?
How do you choose your characters' names?
That's a good question. They kind of choose me. I'll be writing along and then this name will come to me. Isn't that weird?
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're very apt.
yeah, they feel that way. And sometimes I have to struggle a little more. Like Percival Chance, who's a character in here. He's kind of he's a complex character. He's a lawyer and with a lot of baggage. And that name just came to me. And then later, after I'd done several drafts of this novel, I had a student in class named Chance. That was his first name. I had to say, listen, Chance, I have a character, and he's not a good character, and it's not you, believe me, I wrote this. I've got dated copies of my drafts. He said, oh, it's okay. So later he'll probably sue me. But seriously. Yeah, and sometimes one of the things I do, I collect names. So if I hear a name that sounds cool, I'll write it in my notebook. And the other thing I do wherever I travel, and I know phone books are becoming obsolete, but there's still some little places, a lot of where I travel are small places, that have little phone books, and I go through the phone books to see what the names are. And that's how I know the names that are appropriate for a given place. And so when I do a lot of work in the Sandhills, I'll look at the names in the newspapers and the phone books and whatever notices there are, so I can just get a sense of the flavor of who lives there and how they name themselves. And a lot of it gives you a hint about ethnicity and origins and racial and cultural influences. So I like that, yeah. I'm just interested in them, and they do just arrive. What can I say? So maybe your name, what's your name?
Janet.
Okay, Janet. There'll be a Janet soon, I know. Yeah. Don't sue me. I'll make it a good character. Sometimes if I have a little grudge I want to hold against somebody, like there was this nun who gave me a lot of trouble when I was teaching at Catholic Women's College. Yeah. So I gave her name to something. Sometimes it's, but I don't like to name it. I like to name animals after people I like, because I generally like animals. Yeah. So I gave her she had to work for a living. Give her name to somebody who was really working hard. I thought that was appropriate. So there's a little voodoo involved there. Yeah. Somebody else? Yeah. What exactly is what? Who is it? Well, it's, we want to believe it's JB who dies in the first chapter. He does appear later. He comes back over and over and through flashback, and he's kind of haunting Dulcinea too, and because he has a lot of unfinished business. I think Dulcinea is one of the protagonists. I think Rose is one of the protagonists. I think it's a shared kind of, the people you want to succeed, and then there's the people you're not sure about. One of the problems that one encounters in writing is how to make characters have both good and not so good qualities. And the hardest part, Percival Chance was a hard character for me. Have you read the novel? Okay, yeah. Well, the boys are problematic too, because they've been, particularly the one son is sent to be raised by his grandfather, Drum, and Drum Bennett was a problem. I didn't know what drove these people to have such violent natures or why they were so angry and dark. And so one of the tasks I set for myself as a writer is I have to write something from their point of view to try to find out who they are. What gives them the right to walk the earth, and what do they dream of? Because I think one of the operating things for all of us is our dreams, what we want and how we dream and what we desire and what, God forbid, we're willing to do to fulfill that. And so, when I find that out, I know something. I know why Percival Chance is the way he is. And it's pretty clear why Cullen is the way he is. One of the problems with Cullen, the son who's been sent away, is he's so bitter and angry. And he really suffered, and he has a not great outcome. But I didn't want to make him the bad guy. I didn't want him to, one of the problems for me at writing the novel and killing off one of the main characters in the first chapter, which is absolutely forbidden, by the way, never do that, is that I didn't know who killed him. I started out with various ideas and they all proved wrong. So I had to build a plot. I had to find, discover my way through it. So I was as much at, a disadvantage as the two women. I didn't know who killed this guy. And I would say, oh, it's this person, and no, it wasn't. So that was interesting to me. I know it sounds like we should have it all plotted out ahead of time, right? Yeah, no. Most writers don't. Now, if you're a mystery writer, a true mystery writer, a thriller writer, or a romance writer, or a supernatural writer, lots of times you do have an outline because there's certain expectations of things that have to occur at certain points. But if you're writing this kind of novel, you don't know what's going to happen, which makes it fun to do. It's kind of, when you go to the movies, do you want to know what's going to happen all the way through it? Or do you want to be a little surprised? Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the way writing is. I want to be a little surprised because if there's no surprise for me, I'm not going to be interested. If I know the whole story, it just becomes like taking shorthand or, transcribing something. And that's not so interesting for writers. We like to be surprised too. Yes?
You get your characters first or your story first?
Usually some character shows up pretty early on, maybe first. Some novels it's been a character and I had to find the story to fill it all out. And often they are now arriving kind of simultaneously. I'll know, like in the last novel, which started with, the impetus was the New Madrid earthquake of 1815, whatever it was. And so I knew that event and I knew what had happened that I wanted to, but I didn't know how to build it. And in this case, I knew about Wounded Knee, I knew about that ghost shirt, and that stayed with me. And I held on to that for a long, long time. I had been to Wounded Knee too, and I didn't know how to write that. I didn't know when I would write it. And then I received the other part of the story, this business of the grandfather taking his grandson, the oldest son, to raise him, to make him tough enough, so-called, to inherit the land. I heard that's a real story. I heard that. I was told that, and it happened to a family, and I know the guy that it was done to, one of the men, and it destroyed his life just about. And the person he was most angry at for this happening was his mother. I found out about it because my sister said, oh, X's mother is dying. I said, well, and I can't convince him to go see her. And I said, what do you mean? His mother's dying. And he said, oh yeah, he said he'd get around to it sometime. And she said he's very angry at his mother because they allowed the son to be taken away. As if women have all that power, historically, and of course we know they didn't. And so that really stuck with me too. And so those two stories of extreme injustice and cruelty grabbed each other and then began to form the foundation rock of the story. I still didn't know how to put them together. But then it began to happen as I found these characters. Yeah. So yes and yes. Somebody else. Yes?
Did you have any family or any ancestors that grew up out in San Jose?
I didn't. My father and brothers would hunt out there. I grew up in Omaha. My parents are from Missouri. So, but they were hunters. We lived outside of Omaha for a long time, so when I was young, and we lived off the land. We ate deer, venison, we ate squirrel, we ate anything they could kill. They had a lot of kids. So my father he introduced me to the Sandhills. He told me when I was writing my first Western novel, Strange Angels, he said, go to the Sandhills, that's the right place for it. And he always gave me crummy advice like that, like write about our relatives. No, I'm not writing about our relatives. What about our family, blah, blah. No, not doing that. When you're a writer, people want to give you a lot of stories. And I always think they should write those stories themselves because they're not my stories unless I hear that little twangy thing. So I didn't grow up there, but my sister and I grew to love it. I started going out there and I realized he was right. And that was really hard to realize your father's right finally. But my sister and I bought some land out there for a while. But we realized we weren't ever going to be able to move out there and live a life there, so we sold it. It was sad, but it was beautiful land. Are you from the hills?
I'm not. All my family's from around here.
Yeah. But it's a great place, and I hope it stays as isolated and pristine forever. I think it will because it's very hard to live there, to have a living there. We had a couple hundred acres, which was virtually like having, a big backyard. in anywhere else. But it was pretty. It was on the Niagara River, so it was really lovely. And we unusually we had trees because it was on the river there. You know, there was a little thicket of trees. Somebody else? Yes. You're going to have to really speak up.
The quote at the beginning of the book from Willa Cather.
Yes.
Is she an author that you draw a lot of inspiration from?
You know, it's ironic that I found that quote because I don't draw a lot of inspiration from Willa Cather. I'm one of the few Nebraska writers. I know she has laid important groundwork, but the region, what she's talking about is really farming. And what I'm writing about is more what Mari Sandoz wrote about, the Sandhills, and that's ranching country, and also the reservation of, you know, the interaction between Native people and white people is something that drives all my novels. So I don't think Cather that wasn't her world. So I think, you know, how can we say whether it's an influence or not? If I don't feel a direct influence, but maybe because she's a woman and she started to write, and I grew up reading a Nebraska woman author who was critically acclaimed internationally, maybe that did have an influence. I know Mari Sandoz isn't as good a writer as Willa Cather, I don't think, but her work influenced me. The work she did on Crazy Horse, that's a really important novel, autobiography, or not autobiography, biography. Some of her other work showed me what you could do. So, do you like Willa Cather?
I've read some of her.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, you grew up in Nebraska. Did you grow up here too?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had to read Willa Cather. Did you have to read her?
Yeah, in high school we did.
Yeah, we read her in high school, and I thought, okay. But I was reading Homer and Shakespeare. I thought, yeah, okay, and here's Willa Cather. But I feel like I was more influenced by the Southern writers. You know, partly because my family identified South, and I found William Faulkner and loved him, and Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, they just fed me in a way that I always considered them my kind of writing forebears. And also, they tend to lead me to my worst excesses. Because when I start writing Faulkner page-long sentences, I'm in real trouble. And if you see the phrase retrograde sun, you know that I've really gone down the rabbit hole on this one. Every editor just goes, no, don't do that. Because I just love imitating that. Somebody else? Yes?
Similar comment that question that when I read your novels, I feel immersed in the place.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, well, I'm so glad. That's what I want to share. One of the things that's really important. Because I think place really does create us in many ways. Either we're of that place and it's created our identity in part. It tells us a lot about ourselves, or we're not of that place, and that conflict creates, and that tension also creates very interesting identities. So I'm always interested in how people live in a place and what their world is like. When I travel, I do a lot of driving by myself, and I go to small towns. I don't go to cities to ever, if I can help it, to vacation or anything. My idea of a vacation is going to somewhere with 10 people in a town and just living there and driving around little back roads and finding out what the land is like and what people are doing and how they're surviving. I talk a little bit to people, but not overly much. So I don't know what that says. Let's not talk about that. That's very small town, isn't it? Kind of hiding out. One of my dreams about retirement is to move to a small town and I have a horse and just be able to, as I get too old to ride, I just want to hook him up to a little cart and go to get my mail. So it's got to be a really small town that's going to let me go to town in my cart, right? Trot, trot, trot. Have him dump the mail and the groceries in and trot, trot, trot back home. So I don't know where that's going to happen. But if you see me, don't run me down. Please, I beg of you. Somebody else. Yes?
I've got a question about the process of writing. You mentioned earlier you don't plot things out. When you finally do figure out who shot the person, do you find that you inadvertently foreshadow that, or do you go back to the
Oh, I revise a lot. I do a lot of drafting. First I write, I probably do about, maybe 5 or 6 drafts of novels that are about 500 to 600 pages long each. So they're significant redrafts, and sometimes I'll turn the draft face down and rewrite the whole novel once I figure some things out. And then I have an editor, an agent who goes through it and makes me, points out all the problems. And then I work with an editor who does the same thing, so I'm rewriting all the time. And absolutely. And I say I don't know what's going to happen. As I'm going along, I'm foreseeing the plot. I'm thinking this will happen, this might happen, and I'll try some things, and if they work, I keep them, and if they don't, I discard them. And then I have these other people who say, this doesn't make any sense. Why would this happen? And Who Killed JB was a hard one. And so I needed it. You won't be able to figure it out. I hope. I think only a few people have figured it out by the end. I think the majority of people, although when you see who did it, you'll say, yeah, that makes sense. But that's what I wanted. I didn't want it to be too obvious. And because that's one of the pleasures of a mystery, isn't it? And I thought, yeah, that would work. So yeah, if you're going to kill off somebody in the first chapter, it's got to be a mystery. Otherwise, what have you done? You've ended the story. And I didn't want to put that as the first chapter, but it always was the first chapter. Isn't that weird? Well, at one point I had Wounded Knee up there, but that was not a good beginning because, again, it just shut down like a box then, a door. And it was very hard, and I had to lead into that. There had to be a reason to look at that event. And so everyone in the novel is implicated and involved in one way or another, which is how it works. It's kind of fun to do, to find out what you're going to do. I recommend novel writing to everyone. At least write stories, and poems too, because they can always surprise you, and then it's a good way to spend your time. It's better than drinking. I found that out. It's better than all kinds of excess you can indulge in. Sit down and write. Build a story. You can write your own story, the story you want to read.
So how many hours a day do you need for writing fiction?
Well, if I'm in the middle of writing a first draft, I set a page number that I have to do every day. So it's very disciplined. And I get up in the morning and I usually I have to do 5 pages, and I build up to 10, 15, 20. And when that's done, I'm done. And then when I'm in revision, I start revising, and if I can, I try to revise a chapter a day. Sometimes it takes 3 hours, sometimes it takes 5, sometimes it takes 8. But I try, because I have a full-time teaching job, I have to do this on top of everything else I do. And so, it's not a job you have to do all day long, but it is a job you have to carry with you. So what I do is I carry a writer's notebook at all times. So I'm always in double worlds. So I'm writing in the morning, but the rest of the day, if I have a spare moment, I think, oh yeah, that could go in the novel, or oh, yeah, that solves that problem. So I'll keep notes in my notebook. And that way I can feed back into it. Yes? One story at a time. Actually, if I have a good draft of the novel and I've sent it off to my agent, or then I might be writing short stories to kind of keep going. And if I've laid off for a while, like after a book comes out, I might go back to short stories for a while. But I have a discipline and a madness for that too. I decided years ago it would be much more economical to just sit down and write a book. So I'm not very good at take one story and polish it for a year. That kind of makes me insane. I'm not very good at that. But so I'll say, okay, I'm going to write a story a day. I actually had to do that one time. I lied to a publisher and said, yeah, I've got a book of stories, and I didn't. And something terrible had happened. We had a great tragedy in my family, and I really didn't feel like writing. But I finally, we were coming up to deadline, and thought, holy crap, I can't give away this opportunity to have a book published. So, it was a life force thing. So I said to myself, all you have to do is write this much that's good. That's the length of the story you have to tell, at least that much every day. And so every day, and there has to be one good thing in it. That's all. So I gave myself permission to fail all over the place. And so I did that every day for a week until finally, you know, and I saved, those pieces were good, they went into the book. Because every day I just had to do this one little thing, and then finally I built up some stamina and I could write 10 pages. But that took a while, that really took it out of me, but there was a good rawness about it. Because I realized I could just write a story a day. And Edgar Allan Poe said this thing about, he believed that stories should be able to be read in one sitting, otherwise they were too long. And so I kind of took that to heart. I thought, yeah. And so I'm going to write a story in one sitting. And so I do that. And it seems to work. Some days it takes a couple of days. You know, I'll admit that. But I don't think a story has ever taken a week. Now, I'm not saying they're revised and perfect, but the raw ones, I have a draft every day. So I don't think it works to do that. I know when I was a student writer, and I know my student writers do this, you have a story due in workshop for your class, so you write it the night before. Or even the morning of, or the afternoon of. But that's not as effective, because you're only doing one. But if you do a story every day, even a little short one, you get so good at being fast and efficient, and your writing gets really tight and good. Yeah, it's like writing a poem a day. I think that works too. I've known poets who do that, who've written 365 poems by sitting down every day and writing a poem. And, you know, so what if they're not all great? You're just doing it. Yeah. Somebody else. Yes.
Do you have any of these short stories that you turned into a novel?
You know, that is a very good question. I've thought about it. I've got a couple that I wanted to turn into screenplays, because I've written a couple of screenplays too. But one of the things, you know, sometimes I can see the edges of the story kind of branching out and getting bigger, but I like the efficiency of just that world, that quick, hard take. And I don't know that I would branch any of those out. But on the other hand, I'll tell you, my very first book, 2 books of stories, I had a novel called Sweet Eyes, which did get published. And it was so long, the first draft was 1,000 pages, so you know no one wanted it. It was unreadable. And when we got it down to about 500-600 pages, I had all these extra chapters. Because as my husband says, I never met a character I didn't like and want to write a story about. So I had all these extra stories, these characters, and I was writing about a town. And so I took those as short stories and put them in my collections, and they worked just fine. So I went the other way, taking stuff out of a novel, but I haven't gone back. I mean, it's tempting. I may get there. Don't give up on me. Yes?
Is it possible to turn a short story into a novel?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think you just expand the edges. You know, a short story is built, you know that there's a history. It begins in a moment that has a history. But so does a novel. But the short story, you're not going to get a lot of that history. You just feel the fraught edges of history there. And so it's, somebody likened it to opening the shade on a window into somebody's house. And you, for a moment, that's what a short story does. It gives you exactly what's in that house at that moment. And then the shade comes down and that's the end. And I thought, yeah, that's right. But yeah, I think it's harder to, but you could expand out, sure, why not? Give all the history. Go for it. Well, and people do novels and stories now, where they take a series of stories that are related and link them so that there's a kind of overriding, arching, concern, dramatic arc building, and that becomes your novel. So that's good too. I like it when we tear it all down and put it back together. Have you done that?
I consider
Your what?
I consider
Do it. Try it. There's, you know, they can't punish you. They can kill you, but they can't eat you, is my theory. That doesn't sound good, does it? Okay, let's change that. Maybe they can eat you, but they can't kill you. I don't know. But it's your work. You do any damn thing you want. But you learn a lot by trying all these different things and taking these challenges on. And that's an important thing to do, to always, I mean, I'll tell you the truth. Every time I write a novel and I go back to start again, I don't know how to begin. Because every novel has its own rules. And Robert Stone is a pretty well-known writer who said the second novel is the hardest novel because you've published the first novel and you think you know anything, but the second novel has to be better, different, more interesting. It has to answer all the critics. This is all in your head, of course, but it's all different rules. And so it's like starting all over again. And I think that's true for every novel. And so it's kind of exciting that way. It's like you're a baseball player, only you forget how to hit the ball every time you go to bat. So that's a little scary. So who is going to win the NBA, the NCAA championship? Who's going to win the basketball? What?
Who do you got?
In my heart, I want Loyola.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Well, just for sentimental reasons.
Well,
Come.
it's been 50 years since they've been there.
I know, and I'm thinking Kansas.
They deserve it.
Yeah.
Loyola.
Yeah. I don't know. Who do you think?
Loyola.
We always like the underdog. It's a good story.
There was tons of them that came up this year.
Yeah. I like this year. It was fun.
They kind of have God on their side, don't they, with the...
Well, pretty much. When you have a 98-year-old nun scouting the other team, what could go wrong? I mean, honestly. Yeah. Anything else?
Did you realize the spiritual significance of the Ghost Dance shirt when you saw it for the first time? Or
I felt it. I felt something. I did. Well, I kind of say that there was something there, and I thought, you know, in such moments, you don't want to get too rational, logical, you know, and start applying, you know, oh, that's impossible, blah, blah. You know, I tend to just accept what people show me, and I did feel something. And that's why it stayed with me, I know. It just did. And that little thing I said at the end, there might be something. I mean, I think we do have to question official realities. And I don't know about the world. There's a whole bunch I don't know. So I'm willing to give everybody any chance, anything. Have you seen one, or no? They probably keep it a little closer now. I still to this day do not know why that woman showed that to me.
You were supposed to see it.
I felt that she was showing it to me for a reason, but I waited a long time. I didn't want to exploit my experience. I didn't want to exploit the Native experience. I wanted to treat it correctly and honor the loss and figure out a way to tell the story, make the story mean something, rather than just a rehearsal of facts or history. Yeah. I liked it.
I could feel it sitting here.
Yeah, good. I'm always struck. I went up to a Sundance. I was at a Sundance up in Rosebud one time. And I was, again, very much struck by the level of belief and how incredibly stupid human beings are toward each other, that we can't accept anyone else's belief, that I felt the genuine spirituality. I liked it better than my own, to tell you the truth, because people believed so profoundly. And I thought it had to have truth and power to it, because people did believe it. So, anything else? Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to sign any books you have. I'll just sit up here by myself till you come up and say something. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank you all for coming, really appreciate that. Before I forget, don't forget to turn your cell phones back on, or at least the volume. Again, if there's anyone here from Matt McCarthy's criminal justice course and needs to sign in, I have the book up here in front of me. And last but not least, on April 18th, a Wednesday from 4 in the afternoon to 5:15, we have Stephanie Marcellus, who is sitting right over there, and Lynn Brummels for the final reading for the Visting Writers Series for spring 2018. Hope to see you then. And again, Safe travels, and thank you very much.